Hello and welcome to this session in our series on government performance management. Today we will do the case study on Bhutan. Now Bhutan is a fascinating case study because it's one of the finest applications of government performance management systems. Today we will try to find out what is the system that Bhutan uses, why was it implemented, how it was implemented, what are the benefits of implementing a government performance management system, and what are the lessons we can learn from Bhutan for the rest of the world. Now, to take us through this journey and to answer these questions, we have exactly the right person, the best person in my view in the world, and that is none other than the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, Dasho Tshering Tobgay. Bhutan, as you know, is a landlocked country in Himalayas. On one side in north it has Tibet and China. On other sides it has India and Nepal. Now it's a small country of around 250,000 people. It's just like the small island states, except it's surrounded by mountains. It's a very difficult terrain and therefore it truly is an island in a paradise of mountains. But the amazing thing about that is, though it is the second smallest country, I think the smallest country is Maldives, yet when it comes in South Asia, the ease of doing business, it's number one. It is in economic freedom, number one. It is the least corrupt country in South Asia. So it's an amazing paradise, and that's why it is associated with gross domestic happiness index. Bhutan is famous, as I said, for having one of the finest government performance management systems. In particular, it has used the instrument of performance agreement to almost perfection. And as you know, performance agreements are between the principal and the agent, and in the context of Bhutan, the performance agreements were signed between the Prime Minister and the Minister, and then the Minister and the Secretary and the Director General. So there is the trickling down of accountability. It starts right from the top. Performance agreement, as you know by now, has several sections. In Bhutan, they have 5 sections. The section 1 deals with vision, mission, and objectives. Section 2 deals with objectives, actions, success indicators, and target. Section 3 deals with trend values of success indicators. Section 4 deals with description and measurement of success indicators. Section 5 deals with requirement from other ministries, agencies, and dzongkhags. Dzongkhags are the districts in Bhutan. Now here is an example of section 1. So you are familiar with it. Section 2, which is section 1 consists of vision, mission, and objectives. Section 2 consists of objectives, success indicators, and target. And you can see they are all organized in the best practice manner. They have weights, and then they have criteria values, a 5-point scale. We are all familiar with that. Section 3 deals with the trend indicators, so that the performance of a department or an organization can be put in the context. It gives you the previous 2 years' actual achievements and the projected 3 years of targets. And then the section 4 is about the definition of success indicators. And section 5 is the expectations from other government departments if this department has to deliver. To take us on a guided tour of the government performance management system in Bhutan, we have an excellent guide. And that is, as I mentioned, the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, His Excellency Dasho Tshering Tobgay. He is an amazing person. I know him. I've worked with him for many years. He was one of the brightest students at Harvard University at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. That's where we first met. And before that, he had actually graduated from the University of Pittsburgh in mechanical engineering. He is a lifelong civil servant. Before he founded the People's Democratic Party in Bhutan, which was in the opposition, and he was an effective opposition leader, and that is why the people of Bhutan elected him to be the Prime Minister. And now we will have the pleasure of listening to his journey through implementing the government performance management system in Bhutan. Today, speaking to the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, it is among the most amazing experiences, and it's the highlight of my work in this area. I have worked with many leaders, but clearly, and I say this behind his back, so I can say, having him on the camera, that I have never come across a leader of his clarity and his enthusiasm and commitment to public policy and hence to good governance. I have known him for a long time, but that's besides the point. He is Harvard trained, but that's besides the point. The fact is that he implemented a policy which can clearly be called currently the best practice in this area. And there are many large and small and medium governments which have tried this, but the way he did it was extraordinary. And today we are here to speak and share his experience with the rest of the world on how this policy was designed, implemented, and more importantly, why it was done. So I will not waste any further time and ask the Honorable Prime Minister to start by telling us what is this policy of government performance management, or what you call the instrument of performance agreement. For a person who is not initiated in this area, how would you explain what this policy is?
Well, Professor, it's so good to be meeting you under these circumstances. You're so very generous in your words. In fact, too generous. I feel very humbled to be with you. But thank you. You've been my constant supporter. You've encouraged me from the set go. And if I have contributed in any small measure to government performance management system, it is because of my professor, it is because of you. And yes, Harvard is important, but only as important as the fact that that is the place where I met you. You are my professor, and you were teaching me economics. And I remember very, very clearly, you spoke about the need to improve performance, public performance, especially in the public sector, if we wanted to take better care of our economies. And then you said, for those of you who are interested, I will have a brown bag session, a session outside your normal responsibilities, outside the class hours, during lunch. And you forewent lunch, and you came to this seminar hall, and you talked about government performance management at that seminar. Well, it wasn't a seminar. You know, it was just for anybody who was interested. And I was fascinated because you shared with us what the corporate sector was doing. But I remember very clearly, you showed us a contract between the US president at that time and his secretaries. And I said, this is one of the best tools my professor has given me. And indeed, given any other public servant of any other developing country or underdeveloped country. And so you asked about the policy. My personal policy has been to implement the seed you planted within me in Harvard, to articulate the ideas you sowed in me at that time into practice. So that has been my career-long policy, if you can call it that, after meeting you in Harvard. I did try to implement various forms of the government performance management system, what you taught me, what I read, what I understood it to be within the Bhutanese context. Over the years, I was a public servant, especially as a civil servant. And then this served me well when I was in opposition, because in opposition, you hold the government to account, and you need a framework to hold the government to account. And even though we didn't have a GPMS, a government performance management system, in your mind, you kind of have an idea of what the targets are, and you can hold them to account. And when we had the opportunity to serve in government, and I to serve as Prime Minister, this proved to be extremely worthwhile. The government performance management system and the knowledge I had acquired till then, what you had taught me. And so we could start implementing, first piloting government performance management system and then implementing it. Now, this is a long story about the GPMS policy, because towards the end of our tenure, we decided we needed a policy, an official policy, because till then we don't have an official policy on government performance management. And so we drafted a government performance management policy, and it was all ready. It was discussed among the civil servants, all the way up to the Gross National Happiness Commission. It was passed by them, and then it was endorsed by the cabinet, and then we stopped. We stopped for one reason alone, and that was because our tenure was coming to an end. And we took a conscious decision not to introduce any new policy towards the end of our tenure. And so officially, we didn't introduce a policy.
Thank you, but I have to point this out to people who do not know that policy continues. Your successor, the Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, has adopted it and adopted with enthusiasm, which I think is a tribute to the democracy and the democratic traditions that you have in Bhutan. Very few countries, and take it from someone who studies this, where a policy started by a previous government continues, particularly performance management. If in the US, every president comes and has a performance management policy, and which is a remarkable fact people don't know. It wasn't just Mr. Clinton, who of course had performance agreements, Government Performance and Results Act. But then when Mr. Bush came, he sort of modified it, and then there has been modification. But Bhutan stands out as a singular example where the policy has continued in spite of the political change. And you're being kind to me, but Prime Minister, allow me to say that it is also a tribute to your judgment, I would say, and leadership, that people have this trust that this policy was in the national interest and it wasn't something that it was beyond. So it is rare to have institutions being made. And I don't want to put you on spot, but the fact is that you created an institution which people appreciate and continue to do it. So I think that is the remarkable part I find in Bhutan, and we'll come to how this has disappeared in other countries. In other sessions, we will be talking about. I want, for those who still are not clear, so what was this policy? Even though it came towards the end, as you said, the formal enunciation, but in your mind and everyone that I spoke to, it was very clear about it. I mean, it was not that there was no clarity. You were only putting it in words, but it was very clear what people were doing, and there was guidelines and the whole machinery of implementation that was there. But yes, as an official policy which could lead to an act of parliament, maybe that was done towards the end. But perhaps, Prime Minister, if you could just tell the lay audience that what really was this policy and what was the main instrument of this performance agreement that was used.
Well, the policy is actually based on what His Majesty the King, our King, commanded a few years ago. He said, look, Bhutan is a small country. We are sandwiched between giants, sandwiched between India and China. We have a very small population. GDP may be one of the world's smallest. Yet, we have enough resources. Yet, people have accumulated a lot more knowledge and experience than ever before. So what His Majesty actually said was, it is no longer, if you, like in Bhutan, it's not a matter of whether you can do something or can't, whether you succeed or not. Yeah? It's a matter of whether you actually do it or not. Yeah, because we don't have the resource constraints as in the past. We don't have the human resource constraints as in the past, and material resource constraints as we had in the past. And so the question is, are you going to do the work or not? That is the only question. And if you do the work, you will succeed. And this is what His Majesty has said. And this really is the foundations of the government performance management system policy. To get people to work, to commit to work and to actually measure that work without having to worry about resource constraints, human resource.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this also, no, I think it needs to add the contribution of His Majesty. I think that is an important point, because that is what has guided the next Prime Minister as well, and that guides the country in a long-term sense. So he provides that inspiration. So you're very right.
It's in Zonka, His Majesty commanded, "Bear mabegin keva." Bear is to do. The difference is whether you do or you don't. It's not about resources. It's not. So it was very, very clear. His vision was very, very clear. And so that formed the basis of the government performance management system, because on the one hand, the government of the day must commit to providing the resources, both human and material, and also the legislative, the legal framework. And on the other hand, the respective agencies of the government must commit to fulfilling their targets. So basically, in a nutshell, that is the policy. Now, the civil servants are managed under an autonomous agency, a constitutional body called the Royal Civil Service Commission. So obviously, the Royal Civil Service Commission also must agree to not just recognize, but to acknowledge the results of the annual performance agreements of the government performance management system. How else do you recognize whether a civil servant has performed or not? And so that forms a part of the policy also. And also, in terms of building the institution, we have this government performance management department. Now, when we set up the system, the department was placed directly under the Prime Minister's office, under my office at that time. And the idea was that as the system is institutionalized, this department would be handed over to the Gross National Happiness Commission, which is the planning commission in most other countries. But the current government has decided to continue to keep it under directly under the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office until the institution actually matures even more, to give it the attention, but also to showcase to all public servants that this system is very, very important. So again, kudos to them. Now back to something what Professor you mentioned earlier about what people don't know, may not know, is that in America, government agreements, performance agreements, go from president to administration without too much change. I think that is what differentiates the developed world from the underdeveloped. You see, in most of the poorer nations, in the developing nations and in the underdeveloped countries, we don't have this consistency. You know, development must be like both a marathon and a relay. The baton must pass on from administration to administration, from leader to leader. If after every administration the baton is dropped and the next administration must come up with a new baton, or indeed even a new race, just like a relay, we're going to be going around in circles without any end. We want a relay to be a marathon because
absolutely
we want to reach, we want to take the whole country to an end, a better end. And this is not possible by one person. It's not possible by one government. It's not possible in 10 years or 15 years. It's only possible if you have a target and you work consistently and conscientiously towards the target. And this is the beauty of GPMS.
You're so right. I am so glad you've highlighted this point. If you permit, I may just elaborate this point a little bit. Very few people, as you said, realize, they might know, but they don't realize that in the United States, there has been consistency on two things, which is national security, more or less the national interest, everybody agrees. The other thing which all administrations have agreed is the importance of performance agreement. And no matter who has come in power, as you said, but this has been a top priority. Very few people know that even during the Trump administration, the Clinton Government Performance and Results Act was being taken seriously, according to people who are in know of. So, so that you may see on the surface, things may look different, but at the core of it, there was a group which was focused on performance. And because I think one of the big difference between what US did and other countries have not done is that they codified in law. So it is
Professor, yeah. Professor, this is what some people call the deep state.
Well said, well said. But this deep state has some good points, which are that it focuses on the business of the government, and it has continued to do so even during the transition. As you know, when President Obama came, he simply changed that Government Performance Results Act, and he called it the Modernization of Government Performance and Results Act. He modernized it. And that's okay, because things do get changed. I mean, technology has changed, things have changed. But as you said, governments can change, but the concept of budget does not change. Imagine the confusion we would have that if every government had the choice of whether to have a budget or not have a budget. So this is as important as whether to have a budget or not have a budget. So your point is well taken. That is the difference in general between the developing world, that we tend to sort of personalize this aspect. And I must say that in the case of Bhutan, at least, the so far evidence is that it is institutionalized. As you said, the current Prime Minister is also enthusiastic and has in fact decided to keep the Performance Management Division in the Prime Minister's office, which I think is the right thing. Till it nurtures and becomes strong, it's better to keep it in a safe place where people pay a lot of respect. So thank you very much. But I would like to still have in your words a basic description of, you have described, but the performance agreement, the way they were signed and the way you decided and you did it, at what level was it in the US? They do it between the president and the secretary, which in their case is a minister. But how was it different? What did you decide and why did you do? And how far did you take it, both in terms of its coverage, both the wideness and the depth?
Okay. So, when I was serving in opposition, the government did something that I thought was very, very ambitious, and I initially also approved of. Initially, well, I was in opposition, so they didn't need my approval, but I thought it was a good idea. They hired McKinsey consultants for a lot of money. And this is not donor money, this is our own money. A lot of money to develop programs for a few of the sectors in Bhutan. And when I saw what they were doing, basically it was performance agreements. From the macro to all the way to the micro level. And I thought it was good. I had my reservations, 3 big reservations. One was, I think we were spending way too much money to get fresh college graduates. That's not McKinsey's problem, that's our problem. We need to be very careful. The second was that it wasn't government-wide. It was only for a few sectors. So tourism, for instance, health, for another example. I think they were covered only about 3 or 4 sectors. Yeah, and that won't work because some sectors are doing very hard work, the others are not. Yeah. Some are being held accountable, some are not. Some are having to sit through long hours thinking about what they're going to do in 1 year, others are not. See, this is one of the most important things about performance management. You are compelled to think about what you're going to do the next year. Unlike most public departments where you just go with the flow, so to speak, yeah? You become very bureaucratic. The third reservation I had was that the Prime Minister apparently had a dashboard, which went down to the micro of the microest levels. And this dashboard was all encompassing. And I thought that that would be impossible for the Prime Minister to monitor. But I also thought that it would be dangerous because you could get a micromanager up there. If you are a comprehensive micromanager, well, if you can manage, well and good. But the danger is you target, you cherry pick where you want to micromanage. And that turns off civil servants. It may make some civil servants feel good that they are being accorded the importance. It may turn off others to say, why is this guy just interfering in my work and not other people's work equally, right? So these 3 things, one is the cost of the consultancy. The second is that it wasn't nationwide. And the third was that it gave the Prime Minister too much responsibility in terms of managing, especially at the micro level. And so when we formed the government, we formed the government in the middle, third quarter of 2018. And by the 4th quarter of 2018, definitely by December 2013. So definitely by 2013, into the 4th month of our first year, we started efforts on government performance management system. So what I did first is when I went around the country, I went to every district to meet public servants, civil servants, and then also to meet local governments. And I spoke to them about government performance management and I got their feedback. In particular, what I told them was you either get work done or you don't get work done. Yeah? Either way, you're not acknowledged by the government because you don't have a basis to prove that you've done the work. And if you haven't done the work, nobody can, on the one hand, hold you to account for not doing the work because there's no accounting. However, many of those who may not have done the work would have actually wanted to do the work had they had access to resources. Yeah. So it's not, most public servants, it's not that they don't work because they don't want to work, it's because they don't have either the resources or they are not acknowledged for their work. And I said, if you have this government performance management system, you will get your resources and your hard work is acknowledged. And I said, once you are measured and once your work is acknowledged, I mean, you've got to be extremely lazy, extremely careless to not want to work because you want to work. Yeah? And so I went around the country and everywhere I went, people generally seemed to encourage me that perhaps this is the way to go. Now remember, till then we didn't have an understanding of GPMS except for the McKinsey experience, and that too in a few sectors, and that too in Thimphu alone, the capital city alone. So I went to the districts, met civil servants, met local governments, and they were all very, very encouraging. So then I came back to Thimphu, and we set up a small committee, a task force, so to speak. Included in there were planning officers of all the ministries, because ultimately they're the ones who plan the activities and the budgets. And then we had the Royal Civil Service Commission, because they needed to be co-opted into this. We needed their support because ultimately the civil servants want to be acknowledged and they want to be promoted, and that the government doesn't do. It's the Royal Civil Service Commission is their mandate. So they sat together and then they drafted a brief sort of a system outlining GPMS and the annual performance agreement. And if you remember, Professor, at that time, I referred some of our civil servants to you. And I think you spent very long hours with them, helping us structure a GPMS and structure our annual performance agreements. And so this was done well before our first year. And in fact, during the second half of our first year, we signed performance agreements with all the ministries and all the districts. We have 20 districts. So the executive heads of all the districts and the ministers, all 10 ministers. So I, as Prime Minister at that time, signed annual performance agreements with all of them. Yeah. So 10 ministers and 20 executive heads of the districts. That was the pilot. And the understanding or my commitment at that time, my idea, it wasn't a commitment. I said, you put anything you want in there. My job is to deliver my part of the agreement, but let's not monitor ourselves. Yeah, this is the first year. You may not meet the target. You may not understand. I may fail to deliver the resources. So this is the first year, and let's not monitor ourselves. Let's not evaluate. Sorry, we monitored. Yeah. Let's not evaluate performance. Yeah. And so during the year, we had a midterm review, yeah, and to see where we needed to help one another. But at the end of it, we did not actually evaluate it. Yeah. The following year, by then we had the Government Performance Management Department under the PMO, and so we were a lot more well established. And by the second year, again, we had the Prime Minister signed, well, I signed agreements with 10 ministers. The 10 ministers signed agreements with their directors, with their respective directors. Also, I signed agreements with the autonomous agencies of the government. They're autonomous outside the ministries. But we did not sign agreements with constitutional bodies. So the judiciary, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Election Commission of Bhutan, the Royal Civil Service Commission. I mean, they are constitutional and they need to keep the government in check. So if we sign with them, then we are actually working hand in glove. And to keep the separation of powers, to maintain checks and balances, we did not sign agreements with constitutional bodies. Then we signed agreement. So the Prime Minister signed with ministers and the heads of autonomous agencies. Those heads and the ministers signed agreements with their respective directors and secretaries, with their secretaries. The secretaries signed agreements with their directors. At the districts, again, I signed, as Prime Minister, I signed agreements with the executive heads, we call them Zongdas, governors, and then they signed agreements with the heads of local governments. So there are 205 local governments. So they signed agreements with their local governments. Second year around, we actually monitored, we had a midterm review, and we had an evaluation where the department, the Government Performance Management Department, would sit with each and every signatory and then would brief me where, as Prime Minister, where there were shortcomings, where I had to either deliver on my part or call up whoever my counterpart was who had signed the agreement and find out what was happening. So that was the second year. By the third year, we expanded it even further to include the departments of the governments. And by then, the annual performance agreement system signing was being like almost institutionalized. And there are two very, very important Well, overall, we had every year we would identify what the key objectives of the government would be. Yeah, and then what we also did was that the budgets, you would get budgets only, the basis of the budgets approved, not even approved, discussion of the budgets were going to be based on the annual performance agreement.
If I may, if I may point out, this is a truly remarkable development. I hope you realize that very few governments, I in fact do not know any, which does. This is true performance budgeting, because you first focus on performance and then you give them the money based on what the performance they have agreed to deliver. Usually in some countries or most countries, they make the budget and then they say, how much bang can you give for the buck? But basically saying, how much buck do you need for this bang? Because they kind of commit to what they will do, and then you have a discussion, can we fund this thing or not? Which is, in my view, the wave of the future. That's really the correct way to do. You must decide what is the right thing to do, and then figure out the resources and have a discussion. But you must first figure out what is it that country needs first. And I think so. Just wanted to highlight that that's not such a ordinary thing, because you're so modest in saying that. It needs to be pointed out that few countries I'm aware of have done this. And this is true performance budgeting.
Well, well, we have a long way to go. Yeah. Anyway, ministries of finance the world over are known to be very, very, they jealously guard their turf. And budgeting is, as far as they're concerned, their business. You can do your planning, but budgeting, you leave it to us. And so what happens is you're working in parallel. You have planning on the one hand, and you have budgeting. Now, in our case, the danger was you had planning on the one hand, you had budgeting on the other hand, and then you had government performance on the other hand. So it could be really messy. So what we wanted to do is the annual performance agreements within the government performance management system, that had to be the core driver, which gave the framework for budget negotiation. Because the line ministry and the Ministry of Finance, they actually negotiate the budget for the next year. So it had to be based on something. And that basis had to be the annual performance agreement. Now, if budgets couldn't be committed, then the Prime Minister would be informed, and if required, the annual performance agreement would have to be tweaked. But in general, actually, there's enough money to get things done. What's put in the annual performance agreement can be done. And then the whole planning process, you don't need to do it separately. You have your overall plans, you have the overall targets, and that has to be subsumed within the annual performance agreement. One of the advantages was budgeting. The other advantage was every year we would identify priorities, and they had to be included as mandatory indicators in the annual performance agreements. They were mandatory. So whether it was the Ministry of Finance or Foreign Ministry, I'll get back to the Foreign Ministry, or it was an agreement between the Prime Minister and the governor of a district, or the agreement between the governor of that district and a local government head. These mandatory indicators had to be included. So, for instance, women empowerment was one of them. Anti-corruption was another one. Ease of doing business, another one. So on and so forth. Yeah. Now, government G2C, government to citizen services. I remember that was also a big one. Now, there would be, whenever you have annual performance agreements, you have ministries like the Foreign Ministry who say, our work is very broad, it is very conceptual, it is diplomacy, so you can't put it on paper, and in fact, you can't even quantify it. And it took some convincing that yes, you can quantify if you can't quantify it, that means it's not important or you haven't thought it through. So, an example, yeah, government to citizen services, the issue of passports,
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
consulates, consular services,
exactly.
the number of visits that the government takes, whether it's the prime minister, the minister of foreign affairs, the secretary, to any particular country. You don't want it to be too much, you don't want it to be too low. The number of agreements signed with other countries, ease of doing business. On face value, what does foreign ministry have to do with it? Everything, because they are the ones who will be speaking to trading partners. They are the ones who's got to, in our case, they are the ones who will have to work with their counterparts in India, for instance, to facilitate export of goods, so on and so forth. So that was very exciting, yeah, working with the foreign ministry.
But if it is any consolation, a long time back when I was doing some preliminary work, research, as you know, Prime Minister, the first country to do this was New Zealand. Way back in 80s, they had decided they will do everything first best, and it's called the new public management. They started this whole trend, and the first performance agreements were signed. And they, in fact, abolished the position of permanent secretary, and they called them the chief executive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they went that far. And I was in New Delhi speaking with I'd gone to do some research, went to see the ambassador of New Zealand because I had heard so much. And he told me exactly what you just said. He said the last ministry in New Zealand to sign on was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We do things you cannot measure. But ultimately, exactly what you said, without knowing that experience, you said exactly what their prime minister said, and they finally did, and it's a good example. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the third area where I found the annual performance agreements very useful is when I visited local governments, when I visited the villages and blocks of villages, not just the districts. When I went to the village, I had in my hand exactly who committed to who, for what resources, when. And I could look that up and immediately start asking questions to those who are accountable, but also talk to citizens at large about work, about development work, and about what they could expect. So I visited every Geog, which is the local government, all 205 of them during the last 2 years of my tenure. And that everywhere when the annual performance agreement was what we discussed.
Excellent. And in terms of Prime Minister of incentive, what did you think of that? There is a debate that after you have performance agreements, we had a similar policy before we had something in India. There was a policy of memorandum of understanding for public enterprises. And for many years, the chief executives kept saying that, look, you're holding us accountable, but where is the incentive? Of course, there is one that you look better compared to the others, but they wanted financial incentives also. So what is the role of incentives? How did you deal? Was there a debate on what should be the incentives, not monetary, non-monetary? How do you incentivize bureaucrats when you use performance management? Because in a sense, you're asking them to deliver, but why should they?
So what I would like to do is, this is not the most important incentive.
Yes.
Of the three incentives I can think of, the least important, yet what civil servants would consider important, is financial incentives. If I have the opportunity, I would manage the country's finances and budgets and resources in such a way that you actually give bonuses. Right now, we give salaries,
Yeah.
But then we give allowances for civil servants to do work that they are supposed to do.
Right.
And we give certain allowances, which is good.
Right.
But my view is, why give allowances? You give bonuses at the end of the year,
Yes.
or even in the middle of the year, twice a year. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Those bonuses must be pegged to something.
Yes.
It has to be pegged to performance.
Right. No, well
So-
said. Very well said. I mean, Prime Minister, if I may point out, what you're saying is exactly right. In India, the Fourth Pay Commission increased the salaries of civil servants dramatically and said we are giving you a huge rise on the condition that you will have a performance-related incentive scheme. And every pay commission since then, the fifth, the sixth, and even the last one, the seventh, has reiterated that it's a different matter. It hasn't been done, but we'll leave that for some other time.
Yeah, I mean, companies thrive on that, right?
Absolutely.
Corporations, I mean,
Absolutely.
I can imagine a corporation not giving incentives to their employees for getting the work done.
Absolutely. And if I may point out this, to complete the story on public enterprises, which introduced this performance agreement called MOU. And after 7 years, they introduced financial bonus, that if you declared excellent, the chief executive gets a big bonus. After that, if you look at their performance, and I have looked at the data, it just shoots up because they were so charged up now. It's just so charged up. They turned the tables. I mean, at one point, the performance of public sector in India led to bankruptcy. I mean, lack of performance. They went to IMF in 1991. After this policy, the tables have turned around. They're so flush with funds that the government borrows money from them to keep the government afloat and for infrastructure development. So incentives do work, and especially if they're related to performance.
And okay. So incentives work,
Yeah.
and incentives are more than their monetary worth. I'll get back
Absolutely.
to you. Yeah. So the second incentive is promotions.
Right.
In Bhutan, we have our civil servants looked after by the Royal Civil Service Commission. Again,
Absolutely.
as I mentioned, an independent body, a constitutional body. And it's very important to get the Civil Service Commission to acknowledge the work under the annual performance system, annual performance agreements. And so that's a bit tricky. And they don't now, as a constitutional body, I can understand, they don't want to be seen as co-opting the government of the day's policies, lock, stock and barrel. Yet at the same time, they want to support what the government is doing, especially if they think it makes sense. And so it was a fine balance. And I could see, I did not interfere with them, but I could see that they were having a very difficult time. Yeah. So they did have some measurements. Yeah, they took the annual performance agreements. They had their own work plans also based on the annual performance agreement. Every civil servant had to prepare an annual work plan, and they would look. So it was very interesting, Professor. What the Royal Civil Service Commission decided was that for certain types of promotions, or rather, individuals are ranked by their respective agencies. So in this case, let's say a ministry or a department.
Right.
The performance of an individual is ranked. And then you can have an outstanding civil servant, you can have an extraordinary civil servant, you can have an excellent civil servant, you can have a good civil servant, you can have a civil servant that requires a lot more training and work, etc., and etc. This is quite common, right? Now, what happens is in the public service, in departments, for instance, and ministries, you want to rank everybody as outstanding, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you want to be Mr. Popular all the time.
Exactly.
So how else to be popular than to rank everybody outstanding
Right.
at the end of the year, and then they have a better chance of getting
Right.
promotion, at least in time, if not
Right.
ahead of time. So what the civil service did, this was brilliant. They said that the percentage of outstanding employees in a company in a department must be proportionate to the annual performance agreement, the evaluation.
Excellent. Excellent.
So at the end of the year, you're evaluating the annual performance agreements.
Right.
And if you got 95 and above, for instance, you can have this many percentage of outstanding people only. It's not, yeah. But if you get only 80 and above, you can have only this many outstanding. It's just not possible.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
this was a brilliant way of getting our civil
Agreed.
service team.
Agreed. Excellent. It's an innovation I've often thought, but didn't realize it had been implemented in Bhutan. Wonderful. Prime Minister.
So the second incentive is promotions. Okay.
Sure. Sure.
Third, and I think the most important incentive is giving public servants the wherewithal to do public service, to give them the wherewithal, the support, the resources, and the acknowledgement to serve the public, because that's what most public servants aspire to do. And so if you allow them to work, that in itself is a very good incentive. If you acknowledge that they have worked, it's a bigger incentive. So these are the incentives.
So, Prime Minister, I could go on, and I know your time is limited, and we need to move on to another. And I do want two issues which are left, and you can combine them. One is, of course, the main challenges that you may have faced in implementing this. What comes to your mind if you had to advise someone, and how did you overcome that? And what would be your advice to the prime ministers which may be thinking of adopting a policy of this kind?
Well, Professor, how do I say it? I didn't see any challenges.
Okay, no, that's great. That's great.
Perhaps I was so overcome with the possibilities,
Right.
that whatever challenge came my way, I didn't see it as a challenge. I didn't see it as an obstacle.
Okay, great.
Foreign ministry, I suppose. It didn't take a lot of convincing, by the way. Really, my own experience is public servants were happy.
Excellent.
With this. When it went down to the individual level, the annual work plan, which the Royal Civil Service Commission wanted, I think they were a bit jittery out there, even though this is something that you've been doing all along. Okay.
Right.
But when a ministry, even though a minister is signing, it's on behalf of a ministry. When a secretary is signing, it's on behalf of a ministry and director, all that, they actually welcome it. And civil servants, public servants, workers in general, they want it. It should be black and white. You don't want gray, because when it's gray, then you are not acknowledged and you're blamed all the time. You're not acknowledged for your good work. It just gets a lot, very, very confusing. One of the challenges I faced is because our overall development philosophy is gross national happiness.
Absolutely.
And government performance management system was perceived to be very, very capitalistic, very, very corporate culture, borrowed from the corporation, as indeed it is actually, But even there, I mean, it's like, back to foreign ministry. If you can, the work of a foreign ministry articulated into an annual performance agreement, I mean, gross national happiness ideals and values, whether it's culture, preservation of the environment, good governance, these are things that are important for gross national happiness. Community vitality, these are things that are also very important. Opportunities for people, Bhutanese people, all of this can find place in the annual performance agreement and the government performance management system. So it's not what ideology, it doesn't serve any one ideology. It is just a tool that will implement, that will articulate the any ideology, yeah? Translate any ideology into results. Initially, that was I thought that was a challenge to get really work my own mind around it. But since then, I mean, I feel that whether it's climate change or whether it's private sector, social growth, good governance, transparency, whatever your calling may be, you need a tool, you need a framework, and I think that best is performance management systems.
Thank you. Prime Minister, very last question, but you can say anything else that you may have on your mind. Your advice to heads of government, prime ministers and presidents in the Commonwealth who may be thinking of adopting the system, what would you say as a friend to them?
Who am I to offer advice? Yeah?
You have the track record. Who else? You tell me who is more qualified and then we'll go to him. In my view, you are, a lot of people talk. I have taught this subject for a long time, but you have actually from the top taken the bull by the horn. So I don't want to put you on the spot because you know that that's a simple one. You are the right person. And so what would you...
Professor,
yes.
In performance management, indicators matter.
Right.
And in my line of work, the biggest indicator is election results. I lost the election.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a huge failure on my part. So who am I to advise?
No, but so would you say that it wasn't? No. So what lesson would you learn? How would you have done this thing?
But jokes aside,
yeah.
If I failed in terms of election, it seems it's not because of government performance management, because in general, people seem to think, not just think, agree that during the 5 years we were in government, we far exceeded their expectations in terms of delivery of services. Also, the current government is now taking this full steam ahead, like you said, grabbing the bull by the horns, and going all out. The most recent development, which I was really happy to hear, was that they've announced an annual performance agreement month. It's called an APA month. Okay. So they're going to spend a whole month actually devoted to thinking about what goes into your performance agreements, and then finalizing the agreements, perhaps discussing the budgets, and then signing on the agreements, starting with the Prime Minister. And I think that's really, really good. I'm really excited about that. Now, my suggestions to not prime ministers and presidents, no.
Anyone considering this.
Definitely to directors and, heads of agencies my suggestion is I would recall what my king has said, especially in the underdeveloped world. For the underdeveloped world, nothing is impossible. It's the choice is whether you actually do the work or not. There is enough resources, there's enough people, in general, the ground is fertile to sow that seed. It is whether you plant that seed or not. That makes a difference. And in that context, if you want to do the work, if you want to plant the seed, I would suggest performance management, because then it allows you to see your seed germinate, grow into a plant, and bear fruit. And isn't that what development is all about?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. It has been an absolute treat. I mean, this is like a dream come true. I've been wanting to speak to you. We get a chance to speak briefly, but not in such a connected, total, comprehensive manner. So thank you very much. This is going to be a valuable contribution to those who will be looking for inspiration, ideas, and the possibility of doing the impossible. In fact, a lot of people thought this could not be done, and the way you have done, as you said, you didn't find challenge, because this is common sense. When you do it in an organized manner, things become much easier, as opposed to when you don't do it, things then become more complicated. So once again, thank you very much, and we will continue this conversation with you.
Professor, we in Bhutan have a long way to go, but we've been blessed with enlightened leaderships. And when I say enlightened leadership, I'm talking about our kings.
Absolutely.
And they're the ones who've given us the vision and the strength encouraged us to work towards that vision, and given us the strength to work towards that vision. I do believe that the reason why the developed world is developed is because of the accountability. It's proper planning, target setting, and accountability, and all of which is within the government performance management system. I do believe that the underdeveloped world is underdeveloped because we don't have that. And if there's even one small developing nation, whether it's landlocked, a small landlocked country like Bhutan, or a small island country in the middle of the ocean, if we can hold ourselves to account, generally we have enough resources. And if we need something, we need a tool, because everybody wants to develop their people. And I believe that this tool is the government performance management system. This is what I'm passionate about, because it's not just about GPMS, it's because government performance management leads to poverty alleviation.
Absolutely.
It leads to people empowerment.
Absolutely.
It leads to knowledge. It leads to happiness, prosperity, peace. And this is why I'm so passionate about government performance. If you look at the UN rankings, least developed countries, Professor, I want the heads of developing countries, the least developed countries, to go into their history and look into ask the UN experts over the last 40, 50 years, how many least developed countries have graduated to middle income countries? And it is a crying shame that so few have graduated. This is not acceptable. So the UN indicator is just an indicator. Yeah? GPMS is just a tool. What matters is empowering our people. What matters is alleviating poverty. What matters is peace, stability, prosperity, and happiness of our people. And I do believe that GPMS can deliver. If there's any way I can be a part of any country to help, well, I can't help, to share my experiences, I'll be more than happy. And Professor, thank you for having me on this. What a delight. The least I can do to the one person who inspired me to go all out in terms of performance management. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you very much.